So as we reach the end of the decade of centenaries, it's important to reevaluate the commemorations and if they have led to an increase in knowledge in the general public about the activities during that period. So we saw several publications of books, erections of plaques, but unfortunately the information doesn't seem to be spread, in my opinion, beyond those like us, those who are in this room who had an interest to begin with. Recently I was at an event in Limerick, and it was a cultural event, and it was on Kathleen Clark. Well, Kathleen Clark's name was being brought up into it. And in the room where there was about 60 people, only about 5 of them knew who Kathleen Clark was or had even heard of her name. And that was a room full of people who had, connections to culture and who you think might know about our revolutionary history. So that's why I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to reintroduce some of these women, and unfortunately I know that I'm speaking to the converted already, so it's going to be reintroducing women that most of you will have heard about, but people who might be watching this back later might not know about. So the involvement in women in the revolutionary period was essential to the logistics of the operation of any of the campaigns that went on during that 10 years, as women often went unnoticed as couriers and who carried messages and weapons. In those prime positions, though, they were also targets. While they were moving things around, they often went unnoticed, but they weren't completely hidden. For example, the cutting of women's hair was a widespread practice that singled out and marked women as enemies or sexual transgressors or as traitors. Among the victims in Limerick was Una Daly, who was the sister of Kathleen Clark, and Madge Daly. Una had her hand slashed and her hair cut off, and it's to such a degree that they had worried about her life for a moment. So while we're mentioning that, it brings us back to Kathleen Clark again. So I'm going to focus on her and her contributions during this period. The name Daly is synonymous with Limerick and the revolutionary period. Both her father Edward and her uncle John were imprisoned for their Fenian activities, and it was into that family that Kathleen was born in 1878. She was educated in the Presentation School in Sexton Street. After the death of her father, her uncle had gained a lot of wealth, not her uncle John, but another uncle had gained a lot of wealth in Australia and came back, and it meant the Daly family were in relatively wealthy family, so they had a height of privilege. In 1898, Thomas Clark, who had shared a prison cell with her uncle John, came to visit in Limerick, and Kathleen and Thomas promptly fell in love and got married in New York, married in New York. They then moved back to Ireland, settling in Dublin, and we all know about Tom's involvement in this revolutionary period, but Kathleen didn't sit idly by when her family were involved. They're coming to get us. She was a founding member of Cumann na mBan in April 1914, and by 1918 there were 600 branches of Cumann na mBan throughout the country, and it is often forgotten, the women's role. It is, all too often. Each associated branch of Cumann na mBan was associated with the branch of the Irish Volunteers, and in Limerick had the Limerick City branch, the Mid Limerick branch of the East Limerick Brigade and the West Limerick Brigade. The Limerick City branch covered the same area as the Mid Limerick branch, but unlike the Mid Limerick branch, which received its order from the District Council, the Limerick City branch received its order directly from head office. No confusion whatsoever during that time. But it just shows how very much involved women were as well as men. And this year, time around when we're doing the commemorations as opposed to the last time in the 1960s, we did get a little bit more of a focus on women. There was a few more books, there was a few more things, but still nowhere near what should have been done. Angus referred to it earlier on about the different points and where people were viewed and who was viewing them. So back to Kathleen. In July 1921, there were 226 members of the Limerick City branch, and the president was Madge Daly, who was Kathleen's sister, and the vice president was Maria O'Donovan. I'll be talking more about her later. But Kathleen, prior to 1916, prior to the Rising, was sworn in as a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, so she could carry on the campaign even if all the men were imprisoned or killed. So a very integral role that she had. As we know, two of the closest men to her, her husband and her brother, were both executed for their role in 1916, but she didn't go into mourning for very long, setting up the Irish National Aid Fund to aid the families of others killed or imprisoned during this time. In 1917, she joined the newly formed Sinn Féin and was elected to its executive committee, along with other prominent 1916 women such as Kathleen Lynn, Countess Markievicz, Grace Plunkett. And in May 1918, she was arrested because of the German plot, spending 9 months in Holloway Women's Prison in London, along with Countess Markievicz and Maud Gonne. Following her release, she continued with this with her political career. In 1919, she was elected as an alderman for Dublin Corporation and was later Dublin's first female mayor in 1939, serving 2 terms. And that's the point that that shocked me when everybody didn't know about her. Not even about her activities during the revolutionary period, but the fact that she was the first female Lord Mayor in Dublin. I thought it would have been a more notable thing outside of spaces like this. In 1921, while she was in prison in 1918, she was awarded the Freedom of Limerick, but she couldn't receive it because she was in prison at the time. So in 1921, she finally got that conferred on her. And it was conferred on her by the Deputy Mayor of Limerick at the time. Maria O'Donovan, who I mentioned earlier, was the Vice President of Cumann na mBan. Kathleen was then elected to the, before getting her freedom, time periods in this, they all overlap. She was elected as one of the Black Widows in the 1921 Dáil, and she ended up taking the anti-treaty side in the Civil War, as did her sister Madge. So Madge was her older sister back in Limerick. And following the death of her father in 1891, Madge was taken under the wing of her uncle John Daly, who was the future mayor of Limerick. So when people talk about the Daly family, they often talk about the Daly family, but they never mention the fact that it was a lot of sisters, a lot of women in the Daly family that were involved. So Madge was entrusted with the political affairs of her uncle John Daly and taking over the business and the running of it while he was incapacitated. She was under the watchful eye of the IRC constantly, as she allowed her bakery and her home to be used as a base for the Irish Volunteers. During the Easter Rising, Madge was disappointed that there was a lack of action back here in Limerick, and along with her another one of the sisters, travelled up to Dublin, and there they acted as carrying messages from Pearse to local volunteers throughout the city and throughout the county. Like her sisters, she was on the anti-treaty side during the Irish Civil War, and in 22nd of July 1922, it was Madge Daly who led the last group of Republicans, the women of the Cumann na mBan, out of the army barracks on Lord Edward Street before it was shelled by the Free State forces. So the women were very much involved and very much an integral part of what was happening during this period. She was pretty much responsible for the erection of the monument we see on Sarsfield Bridge. Although there was other members of the family involved, it was through her instigation and her pushing that actually got completed. While Kathleen Clarke was in the Dáil, was in politics in Dublin, another number of other women stepped up locally in Limerick. First of these was Emily Crowe, and that's a name that's almost eradicated, the Emily Crowe. She was the first woman on the Limerick Corporation here on the Sinn Féin ticket in 1920. And for the first few months, the first year, she was the only woman on the corporation. Unsurprisingly, she was a member of Cumann na mBan, and she was the maternal aunt of Robert Byrne, whose death in 1919 led to the Limerick Soviet, which probably undoubtedly strengthened her resolve to get into politics. There was a big push in 1920 to get women into politics, so she was part of that. In March 1921, two sitting members of the council, the Mayor George Clancy and the former Mayor Michael O'Callaghan, were murdered, and that's when a second woman came in to the council chamber. Maria O'Donovan, who we mentioned before, was a member of Cumann na mBan. So she finally joined Emily in the chamber, and she was only in the office a short while when she was named deputy mayor, while the mayor was over in New York, travelling through New York trying to raise funds. As previously mentioned, one of her roles at the time was to confer the freedom of Limerick onto Kathleen Clarke. Although Marie O'Donovan was born in County Cork, she and her sister Kate O'Callaghan made Limerick their home. She joined the Gaelic League in Limerick and was a prominent member of Cumann na mBan. And she was a small band of women who were in Limerick who were involved in the suffragette movement. And it's really important to note that the suffragette movement was also happening at the same time. You know, women didn't get the vote until, some women didn't get the vote until 1918 because there was a tiered system and that. So there was the mixing of what was happening in the freedom, in the revolution to try and get Ireland as a unified state, and there was also trying to get women to get the vote at the same time. They played two roles. So when Marie O'Donovan died in 1961, she was still the only woman to have worn the memorial chain at that stage. So that was 40 years that there was no other woman who wore it. Her sister Kate O'Callaghan was the wife of one of the murdered mayors. And that happened in March 1921, and by May 1921, she was in the Dáil. She had been voted into the Dáil while she was still in full mourning alongside Kathleen Clarke. Kate O'Callaghan said of the Irish War of Independence, "Women do not cry much in Ireland during this war. The trouble goes too deep." Because they had to take care of what was happening on the outside of their families and on the inside of their families, and try and progress it further. The British Intelligence Office kept a file on her which called her a clever and dangerous woman who makes the most of her propaganda and her fanatical hatred of the Crown forces. So they weren't biased, or she wasn't biased. They held her beliefs on her shoulder the entire way. While on her way to a political funeral in April 1923, she was arrested and taken to Kilmainham jail, which she was released after a 19-day hunger strike. It was one of the ways that women could fight while they were in jail, was to go on hunger strike. It was kind of a Mickey Mouse cat and mouse system, because they were released on health grounds, but if they did anything afterwards, they would be taken back into prison. It was a cat and mouse. Following her death in 1961, she was given a Garden of Honour and buried in the Republican plot next to her husband. The wife of the other mayor who was murdered at the time, Molly Clancy, I can't pronounce her name, didn't enter politics like Kate O'Callaghan. Instead, she focused her work in a different way. She focused on the cultural aspect, and as we saw earlier in one of the earlier talks, how important the cultural aspects were during this period. She was highlighting the importance of the Irish language, and on her census return in 1911, her father recorded his name in English, but her mother and the rest of the family recorded their names in Irish, which was in itself a standing up to what was considered the norm at the time. She, like all the other women mentioned, was a member of Cumann na mBan and was heavily involved in the local Gaelic League. She was a member of the Strand House Memorial Committee, which erected a plaque on the Strand Hotel, and again was buried in the Republican plot. Another one of the women from this time was Mary Parole, a member of Cumann na mBan, member of the Irish Women's Franchise League, and a member of the Celtic Literary Society. And she took on the cultural aspect. She was a co-worker of Arthur Griffith and others in the Irish Literary Society, and one of the founders of, I'm not going to pronounce the Irish version of it, but the Daughters of Ireland under Maud Gonne. She played an important role in 1916, relaying messages again between Pearse to Waterford and to Cork and Tipperary, calling out for the troops. On the 2nd of May 1916, she was arrested and charged with the ownership of the Spark, a seditious weekly paper run by James Connolly, and she was found guilty and imprisoned in Mountjoy jail, waiting deportation to England. She was arrested for sedition for holding that, and could have been carried the death penalty, but she's a woman, she escaped execution. She was back in Ireland before the year was out and was performing in plays in the Irish theatre. She worked for the Irish Women's Workers' Union after her release and was the president of the union. So again, the interlace of women in suffrage and women in unions and how they all played across the board. As Tom was talking earlier about the importance of friendship, and that we can see throughout, it was a case of all these people knew each other and their ties were very important. Although Cumann na mBan played a primarily supportive role during the Irish Wars of Independence, or the Irish Civil War, it was not without its dangers. We saw a Limerick woman was the first victim of the Civil War. Margaret Hartney Glynn from Limerick City was killed when a shell landed out in Adair. Although tragic, Margaret would have known what she was getting into when she was in Cumann na mBan following the Irish volunteer during the Civil War, going out to these military posts. There was other people like Winifred Barrington who were simply caught in the cot fire. Winifred had travelled from Glenstall Abbey out to Newport, where she met the district inspector, who was an unpopular RIC officer, and two other men, and she and her female companion travelled with them. And as they were returning, they were ambushed, and Winifred was killed along with the district inspector. So, although women were in it, they were also not in it, just as men were in it, but also not in it. She had a massive funeral. There was a huge turnout for that. And although she wasn't involved in any of the conflicts, people often turned on her and said if she was riding in the car with somebody, then obviously she was. Quaylen mentioned earlier on Helen Lard, who was a sponsor of one of the of Donnellan Press, but she was an actor and writer and scientist and political activist born in Limerick. And for anybody to have that many things on their resume is a lot. But She would take her activism to the stage and use her voice during letter campaigns. She was really involved in the Women's Franchise League with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, and she was attacked at least once while she was walking while wearing her badges. As with Helen Lard, Mary Spring Rice on first glance seems like an outlier on the revolutionary period and an unlikely Republican because she was born into the upper echelons in Irish society. And although she was born in London, she returned to her ancestral home in Mount Trenchard near Foynes as an infant. But her household she was raised in Gaelic culture and encouraged where possible to be involved in Irish culture. She was an Irish speaker and hosted Cumann na mBan lectures in Mount Trenchard. We saw earlier on about the Asgard, and Mary was involved in that, in her role in that. She had asked first whether her small fishing smack, the Santa Cruz, could be used during that time, but it was unsuitable for the journey. So instead she joined the others on the Asgard when they came in 1914, reaching Hoth Harbour. Many other guns, as we know, were used in the 1916 Rising. That wasn't the end of Mary Spring Rice's activity in the Republican movement. In the outbreak of the War of Independence in 1916, she set up first aid classes, and that's another point where women were vital. It was the setting up of first aid classes, the being involved in the medical care of those who were injured. So she managed, like so many of the other women, to move freely around Dublin as a member of the gentry, carrying messages between the IRA headquarters. These women represent only a tiny percentage of those involved during the revolutionary period in Limerick or from Limerick. Unfortunately, those of us here can be blinded by our echo chamber, and these biographies will continue to be eclipsed by sexier stories from modern celebrities and are destined to be forgotten once again, as they haven't really permeated widely outside of history circles. That is, of course, until in 100 years' time, when those like us once again gather to discuss the lives of people and shed new lights on their stories. I'm thinking perhaps we should create a TikTok dance. And maybe we could keep their names alive in that way. Thank you.